There is one line in the Buckingham Palace statement that does not work. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. The statement arrived short and flat, the wording used when something enormous must sound like housekeeping. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style and titles currently held by the Queen. Sit with the first 4 words. His Majesty has today, as if the King considered the matter over breakfast and began before the coffee cooled. 4 minutes passed inside the room from the first page to the moment Camilla could not rise. A decision read in 4 minutes is not built in 4 minutes. That gap is the entire story. Inside a sealed royal council, a decision was placed before the crown that no one in Camilla's circle believed could survive. Catherine received the Queen Consort title. With that page, the position Camilla had defended for years ceased to be hers. The clerk read the operative wording. Color left her face, and she collapsed before anyone could reach her. I am Mark Holden. This is Mark Holden Reports. I examined the records and the reporting and set out what appears to have occurred. The detail most overlooked sits at the foot of the final page. The name under the authorization line is known and will be held longer. Given too soon, it looks like a signature. Held in order, it explains why a woman who survived 30 years of British... Camilla sat upright beside Charles, waiting for the interruption she expected. She had built her place on such interruptions. Someone always spoke. A private secretary would request delay. An advisor would ask for another look. The king would say later, and the room would rearrange. That morning, he said nothing. His silence carried more weight than any speech. The council had approved a royal settlement. A settlement makes a decision real. Without it, everything remains opinion. With it, the title moves. The council had authorized the transfer from Camilla to Catherine. Once it existed, no persuasion could reverse it. Catherine lowered her eyes. She did not smile. Nothing indicated triumph. William understood. His wife was being advanced through another woman's public undoing, and the two could not be separated. Every honor arrived attached to someone else's worst mourning. Camilla turned repeatedly toward Charles, searching his face for resistance. His hands stayed flat. He did not look up. Confidence drained from her with each second. The clerk reached the decisive sentence. Camilla's fingers closed on the table. She pushed back, tried to stand, and lost balance. Aides moved. The room broke into noise. Charles stood several feet away and did not move. Catherine stayed beside William, shaken by the cost. William noticed a notation at the foot of the document. The transfer had been prepared before the meeting. No one decided it in the room. It had been typed, checked, and held ready while Camilla dressed for a meeting she still believed she might influence. Aides helped her to the door. She turned once. Her voice was thin. You knew. Everyone heard the 2 words. The question became how those closest to her had allowed her to enter believing herself secure. Someone in her household knew and said nothing. The council altered a title and fractured 3 relationships, each left carrying a distinct injury. Camilla had believed the Queen Consort title meant more than ceremony. It was proof that decades of controversy and dislike had ended in acceptance. The loss struck deeper than protocol. The title had never been fixed. Charles and Camilla married in 2005. Clarence House stated she would be Princess Consort, not Queen. That changed in February 2022 when Queen Elizabeth expressed her wish that Camilla be Queen Consort. She was crowned in May 2023. 3 answers in 20 years, each by decision rather than law. Camilla knew a title that moves twice can move a third time. In 1996, Diana lost the style of Her Royal Highness. Camilla had observed that debate and spent 20 years ensuring the machinery would never treat her standing as negotiable. Catherine left under different pressure. She had expected a gradual transfer of responsibility. Instead, it arrived in a room where an older woman collapsed with her name already on the page. In a side room, she told William she did not want her elevation remembered as the morning Camilla was undone. He answered that public refusal would create a second crisis. He was accurate, and both knew it. William remembered walking behind his mother's coffin at 15. He has spent his adult life ensuring his wife never stands exposed and alone as Diana did. That instinct operated strongly. Charles went alone to the room where Camilla recovered. She turned to the window. He offered his hand. She withdrew hers. Tell me why you said nothing. He admitted he had known a change was under discussion, but insisted he had not seen the final wording that moved the title at once. She regarded him with disbelief that rendered the defense irrelevant. He had known enough to recognize danger and allowed her to enter without warning. She had prepared that morning. He had watched her. Silence has been his instrument for decades. It has never contained a fire in this family. It only decides who is surprised. William examined the council dossier and found objections to Camilla's authority had accumulated for months. One date repeated beside several entries. It belonged belonged to a private ceremony at Windsor 3 months earlier that few outside the household knew had become problematic. That moment occurred during a closed ceremonial rehearsal at Windsor. No cameras, no court circular entry. Camilla, Catherine, William, and a few staff. The purpose was to settle positions for future state occasions. Camilla expected her place beside the crown to remain undisturbed. Catherine's responsibilities had already expanded. Camilla accepted growth beneath her authority, not around it. She directed that Catherine be moved further back in the formation. Her voice did not rise. The meaning was clear. There can be only one queen beside the crown. A senior staff member recorded the instruction without being asked. William challenged the instruction at once. The approved arrangement reflected Catherine's future responsibilities and had been approved for a reason. Ceremonial position signals the direction of authority. Moving her backwards signaled the reverse. Catherine asked him quietly not to escalate. The humiliation had already landed. She had been corrected before those who organize her work and made to appear adjusted at whim. A woman recovering from illness and returning to duty was walked backwards by the woman who had entered under a promise she would never be queen. No one looked at her. Catherine had observed what became of the last unprotected woman in this family. The ceremony secretary produced a written record that evening because the instruction altered an approved arrangement. It preserved Camilla's words, William's objection, Catherine's attempt to calm the exchange, and the date. Charles received it and privately reversed the instruction. He did not confront his wife. He believed silence would confine the damage. Silence buried it. Camilla dismissed the record as administrative tidying. Months later, it appeared near the front of the council dossier as the clearest evidence that her authority collided with the planned transition. Her anger turned toward Catherine. The two women met alone in a private room. No advisors, no clerks. Camilla had requested it and set the condition that no one else be present. She required the truth from a human mouth. Catherine agreed because continued bitterness would damage William's future reign. Both remembered the harm of rival courts in the 1990s. Camilla did not waste time on preliminaries once the door had closed. She turned fully toward Catherine and asked the question that had been forming since the moment the clerk began reading in the council chamber. "Did you know they were giving you my title?" Catherine held her gaze without flinching and answered directly. She had known that changes were under discussion. She had not known the council would move the position that morning. The reply did nothing to calm the older woman. Camilla's voice remained controlled, which made the words land with greater force. She accused Catherine of standing quietly by while years of criticism accumulated around her, of keeping her hands clean, of saying the correct things in public, and of collecting at the exact moment the pressure finally broke through the floor. She was not shouting. She was building a case, laying each element carefully so that the picture would be impossible to deny. Catherine's restraint hardened into something firmer. She told Camilla she had never asked to be raised through another woman's humiliation. The line carried weight because there was no triumph behind it. Catherine had witnessed the collapse in the council room. She had watched Charles freeze in the middle of the chamber, a king rendered still by a document he himself had authorized. In that second, she understood that whatever authority came with the title would remain permanently welded to the manner in which it had been taken from somebody else. Every future appearance, every ceremonial duty, every public smile would carry that association whether she wished it or not. Then Catherine offered something Camilla had not expected. In a private conversation with William before the council session, Catherine had pressed him to support a delay. She feared an immediate transfer would read less like an orderly change of responsibility and more like a punishment handed down in public, and she had said so plainly. William had listened. Neither of them controlled the final decision, and both of them knew that going in. The revelation altered the shape of Camilla's anger in real time. If Catherine had tried to slow the transfer, then Catherine was not the force that had driven it forward. Every hour Camilla had spent constructing a case against the younger woman had been spent facing the wrong direction. The realization was almost as destabilizing as the loss of the title itself. Camilla stepped closer and asked the question that suddenly mattered more than everything she had come into the room to say. Then who wanted this? Catherine paused only briefly before answering. Ask the people who signed it. Those 5 words redirected the entire confrontation. They removed the personal duel and placed the responsibility where it had always belonged, inside the formal machinery of the crown, rather than in the rivalry of two women. That answer changed the room and changed the story. Camilla left the private meeting and went directly to examine the authorization page herself. She recognized the names she had expected and half prepared for: the council members, the senior officials, the household signatures that appear on any document carrying this weight. Her eyes moved steadily down the page until they reached the final line, Charles. His signature sat under the settlement, her husband's name in her husband's handwriting on the instrument that removed her title. The sight of that signature turned her anger colder and quieter. If the king had authorized the transfer, then the fight had never been between two women, not once. It had been running inside the machinery of the crown, and both of them had been standing in the wrong argument. Camilla could contest Catherine. She had been fighting for position inside this family since the 1970s and was more practiced at it than almost anyone alive. She could challenge William, freeze out advisors, maintain a grudge against the council for the rest of her life. One signature removed all of those options at once. Charles had approved the instrument in his own hand, hesitating over it by every account of that week in the precise place where the sovereign's authorization makes a matter final and irreversible. The moment Camilla saw his name under the transfer, she understood that the decision had crossed the single line she had believed would always hold. Her husband had chosen the crown over her. The page itself was ordinary in appearance. There was nothing dramatic about the paper or the ink, yet it carried the full weight of constitutional process. Without that signature, the council's work remained inert. With it, the title moved, the diaries changed, the access altered, and the public face of the monarchy shifted. Camilla had spent decades learning how power operated in this institution. She had watched titles conferred and withdrawn, loyalties tested and broken. Nothing in that long education had prepared her for the quiet finality of seeing her husband's name in that particular place. Charles understood exactly what his signature meant when he placed it on the page. The royal settlement cannot take effect without the sovereign's authorization, and that places final responsibility on him whether he desires it or not. There is no committee behind which to stand on that line. There is only a space and a name, and everything the council assembled before that moment remains without force until he writes. He had resisted an immediate transfer for weeks. He feared confusion around the structure of the monarchy. He feared the headlines that would follow. Above all, he feared what the decision would do inside his marriage, by then the only part of his life that had never been subject to negotiation or public scrutiny in the same way. Resistance has a limited life inside an institution of this kind. Once the council placed the full case before him, further delay began to look less like caution and more like a man using the powers of a king to protect his wife. He sat alone with the file after the decisive meeting and read the signed page again. He removed his glasses, set them beside the document, and remained silent for a long time. A senior aide waited several feet away and did not break the quiet. Charles finally admitted the conclusion he had been circling for weeks. Protecting Camilla indefinitely would create a larger difficulty than the transfer itself. If he appeared willing to preserve her position while constitutional objections gathered inside his own council, then loyalty as a husband would look stronger than duty as monarch. That is the one accusation this family cannot survive twice in a generation. The last time a Prince of Wales allowed private loyalties to run ahead of the public role, the country spent 10 years arguing about Diana across the front pages, and Charles sat through every week of it. By the time the council's case reached its final form, it had moved well beyond the Windsor rehearsal. Catherine had been carrying increasing public responsibility for years. She had absorbed ceremonial load, stood beside William as his role widened, and taken appearances that once sat elsewhere. Council members had reached the view that the monarchy was already operating as though the next phase had begun, while its formal structure remained locked into the previous one. The Windsor incident simply placed that contradiction on a dated page with names attached, the only form an institution of this kind can act upon. William made one decision of his own, and it is the decision most people continue to misunderstand. He refused to demand Camilla's removal in person, not once, in any room, on any paper. He understood that a request of that kind from him would make the entire matter appear as a son displacing his father's wife for personal advantage, and that version of events would follow him into the reign and never leave. He left the final judgment where it belonged, with Charles. That refusal removed the easiest excuse the king might later have used. There was no ultimatum from the heir, no family pressure that could be pointed to afterwards. What remained was a file, a council recommendation, and the king's own hand. By the following morning, the decision had stopped being words on a page and begun rearranging Camilla's life in quiet, practical ways. Doors, diaries, staff, and the folder that had arrived with breakfast for years. The cruelest part of the story did not occur in the council chamber. It occurred over the next few hours in small adjustments that no one announced and no one explained. Camilla noticed the missing folder before anyone offered an account of it. The morning council briefing had formed part of her routine for years, carrying the updates tied to her ceremonial duties, her patronages, and the matters coming up in her working month. That morning the tray arrived as usual. The folder did not. Access is where royal influence actually lives. Whatever newspapers write about titles, the briefings, the diary slots, the staff who wait for instruction, and the quiet ability to shape what happens next week matter far more. Take the title and leave the access, and a person keeps most of their practical power. Take the access, and the title becomes little more than a word on a place card. She asked an aide where the folder was. The aide answered softly in the tone people use when they have been told to expect the question. Camilla said nothing at first. She looked at the untouched breakfast tray, and a lifetime of instinct reached the conclusion in real time. The transfer was already real. It had been real since before she woke. Meetings began disappearing from her diary. Staff instructions started arriving from another office. Everything that had come to her automatically by reason of her position was reorganizing itself around a different woman, and none of it required a single conversation with her. Charles came in later and found her still seated. He attempted to begin gently. She cut straight through the careful language. The palace had managed to erase years of her structured work before she had fully understood what was happening to her. He answered that her charitable work would not disappear, that the causes remained hers and would stay hers. She shook her head. He had missed the essential point, and the fact that he missed it told her how far apart they were now standing. The structure around her had changed overnight. No reassurance from him could make the change feel temporary, because it was not temporary, and he had signed the page that made it permanent. Then a message arrived that no one had prepared her for. Catherine had refused to move into Camilla's former private office. She had instructed staff to leave every personal item exactly where it stood until the Queen Consort herself decided what should happen to it. The photographs, the papers, the objects on the desk remained untouched by direct order. The message reached Camilla through a household aide. For the first time since the council meeting, her anger lost its footing. Catherine was behaving like a woman who had witnessed the collapse and could not remove the image from her mind. That realization disturbed Camilla almost as much as the transfer itself. It meant the conflict could not be reduced to an enemy standing on the other side of a door. She had built her survival in this family on always knowing who the enemy was. The enemy had declined the role. By evening, Camilla reached a decision of her own. She wrote a short note by hand and asked Catherine to meet again. No advisors, no officials, no Charles. The two of them met with no counsel standing behind either one, and the crisis ceased to be an argument about rank. Camilla did not arrive looking for someone to blame. Catherine did not arrive prepared to defend herself. The anger from the first confrontation had burned down into something quieter and more hazardous because neither woman had anything left to hide behind. Anger is comfortable because it tells you where to stand. Remove it, and two people are required to look at each other without the protection of position. For the first time since the council decision, the woman who had lost the title and the woman who had inherited it spoke as two people rather than two formal roles. Camilla had requested the meeting because anger had stopped producing answers. Attacking Catherine would not reverse the settlement. It would not repair anything between her and Charles. Catherine respected that by arriving alone, with no staff waiting in the corridor to carry messages outward. Whatever happened in the room would remain private instead of becoming another piece of palace machinery by morning. Camilla spoke first. She admitted the title had wounded her, and then moved past it. The deepest cut had nothing to do with rank. She had walked into that council chamber believing Charles would protect her, and she had sat there watching him decide not to. The king had been the last place in her life where personal loyalty could still outrank procedure. That belief was gone, and at her age it was not going to return. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she offered a truth of her own. Receiving the position had not felt like a victory. It had felt like inheriting a role through somebody else's pain. She knew every appearance she made for the rest of her life would be measured against the morning Camilla went down in front of the council. Every success would be read by someone as proof that one woman had risen because another had fallen. She would carry that association, and she said so without asking for sympathy. Camilla asked the question she had carried since the folder failed to arrive at breakfast. Would Catherine take everything? The charities, the causes, the personal work attached to the years she had spent beside Charles, the osteoporosis campaigning, the literacy work, the entire map of a public life. Catherine answered at once, no. Then she drew the distinction that mattered. Institutional succession means the formal transfer of a royal responsibility from one person to the next. It moves the role. It does not require the erasure of the person who held it, and Catherine had no intention of turning a necessary transition into a personal punishment. Camilla could keep the causes that had become her identity. Catherine would not touch them. That answer altered something in the room. Before she left, Camilla Camilla reached for a handwritten set of private notes she had assembled over her years in the role. Warnings, pressures, small lessons no official briefing has ever contained, because no official briefing is written by someone who has been widely disliked and still required to smile at a camera. She handed them across without a speech. She was acknowledging the reality, and both of them knew it. The transfer would stand, and she had decided the woman inheriting the position should not walk into it unprepared, which was the exact courtesy no one had extended to her. No one has confirmed a single word that passed between those two women behind the closed door. The paperwork that emerged from the week says enough on its own. The family had reached a fragile understanding in private. Outside the palace gates, Britain was only beginning to learn what had occurred. By sunrise, the private crisis belonged to the world. Telephones lit across newsrooms. Broadcasters dropped scheduled programming for continuous coverage. Editors dismantled front pages they had finished hours earlier. The country was reading a closed council decision as a judgment on two royal women and on the direction of the monarchy itself. Among thousands of headlines, one image performed more work than all the commentary combined. Catherine entering the palace and Camilla's car leaving quietly through another gate. Buckingham Palace issued the formal announcement shortly afterwards, confirming that Catherine had assumed the Queen Consort title as part of a wider royal transition. The wording was controlled, as it always is. The meaning underneath it was substantial. This was no temporary adjustment. The title had moved. The ceremonial balance had moved with it. The palace was publicly acknowledging a change that had already rearranged life behind those doors. William watched the first television reports beside Catherine and said very little. Commentator after commentator described her elevation as a victory. The prince knew how completely his wife rejected that word. She had not entered the new role in any spirit of celebration. She had entered it knowing every headline about her rise would reopen the account of another woman's collapse, and that the two stories would be printed side by side for years. Camilla watched the same coverage in private. She held herself together until one presenter described her years beside Charles as an era abruptly closed. That is what reached her. She had already accepted the title was not returning. Hearing her entire time in the role reduced to a finished chapter by a man reading an autocue made the loss public in a way the council chamber never had. Private grief had become a segment between the weather and the sport. One front page defined the day. Outside Victoria Station, a special evening edition appeared with two large words across the top: a new queen. Underneath them, two photographs sat side by side. Catherine entering Buckingham Palace, Camilla leaving earlier the same day. The contrast was deliberate and brutal. One woman moving toward the center of royal life, one woman moving away from it, printed at identical size so that no one could miss the arithmetic. Camilla left through a side gate to avoid the photographers at the front. The photographers at the side gate captured her anyway. That is the image that ran. A woman in a car looking straight ahead, in the seat she had occupied for 20 years, traveling in the opposite direction from the palace. The mood outside the gates divided in the same way. Crowds gathered behind the barriers, some holding photographs of Catherine, some openly saying they felt for Camilla. Britain was watching succession, loss, ambition, and family damage collide in front of the cameras, and many people did not care for the feeling it produced. The name under the authorization line was the King's. It was held back because on its own it looks like a husband betraying a wife. In proper sequence, it is something else. The council did not remove a title from Camilla because of a rehearsal at Windsor. The rehearsal was the evidence, not the reason. The reason is that this monarchy had already handed its working future to the next generation and left the paperwork with the last one. William took the Duchy of Cornwall in September 2022, and everything that followed pushed more of the load onto him and onto Catherine. Watch who has been carrying the ceremonial weight, and then look at who held the senior consort position on paper. Those two answers stopped matching a long time ago. Camilla's instruction at Windsor forced the contradiction into the open. She reached into an approved arrangement about how duties pass between generations and moved a name backwards. By doing so, she told the council something it could not ignore. Given the choice between her own standing and the transition the institution had already committed to, she chose her standing. That is what the council read on that dated page. That is what reached Britain when the reasoning began to emerge over the following week. The country expected a scandal. The country received a machine quietly correcting itself and finding a queen in the way. There was no reversal, no last-minute intervention, no hidden clause returning the title to the woman who lost it. Catherine remained Queen Consort. Camilla accepted that her chapter in the role had closed. Charles was left carrying the price of choosing the monarchy over over his marriage at the one moment he could not protect both. The meaning of the crisis did not sit in the council document. It sat in what each of them did afterwards. Camilla understood first that the transfer was final. The palace confirmed Catherine's position permanently, while the former Queen Consort retained carefully defined charitable and family responsibilities without the title she had believed completed her journey. That distinction allowed her work to continue after her constitutional position ended. It is a smaller consolation than it sounds at 11 o'clock at night. Charles made no attempt to reverse the settlement, confirming what the signature had always been, a final decision rather than a moment of pressure he would later withdraw. He met Camilla privately before the family's first appearance following the announcement. He apologized for allowing duty to become secrecy and admitted he should have told her how serious the council discussions had become while there was still time for her to prepare. She listened and answered with the truth that had run beneath the entire week. Losing the title had hurt. Learning he had been afraid to tell her what was coming had hurt more. Charles had no defense for that. He accepted it because a man who has spent 50 years managing this family knows when he has been caught doing the thing he always does. That is the pattern no one in this family has broken. Charles grows quiet. The silence does the damage he was trying to avoid, and a woman learns from the paperwork. Diana learned it. Camilla spent 30 years believing she was the exception. She remained the exception until the morning she was not. Catherine came to Camilla shortly afterwards with none of the triumph the commentary had attached to her. The two women stood together with no advisors between them. Camilla noticed a small fold in Catherine's sleeve and straightened it almost by reflex, the way one does for someone before they walk into a room full of cameras. Carry it better than I did. Catherine thanked her quietly. No dramatic embrace, no rewriting of the week. The gesture meant more than an embrace would have because both women accepted the reality of the transfer without pretending the pain had gone anywhere. William understood the wider shape of it as he watched them prepare to step forward together. This had never been about replacing one woman with another. The monarchy had accelerated into its next generation before events forced a harsher version of the same transition on everyone. The council handed Catherine the title, and no one walked away from that week a winner. One woman gave up the position she had fought years to reach. Another accepted a burden shaped like a crown that she could no longer defer. A king discovered that protecting the monarchy sometimes means living permanently with the wound he made in order to do it. Camilla spent 20 years ensuring that title could never be taken from her. She managed the press, the household, the family, and the one man whose name alone could remove it. In the end, the page required none of her enemies. It required only his hand, and he gave it. She was the last person in Britain to learn it.